Flight attendant laughs at black man's cheap suit. She regrets it when he makes one call. They say you never really know who you're sitting next to on an airplane. It could be a future friend, a brilliant inventor, or even the key to changing your entire fate. This is the story of one flight attendant who discovered just how true that statement could be, except her discovery came at a terrible price. When Vanessa Morgan scoffed at Jacob Thompson's suit and made snide remarks about his appearance, she assumed he was just another passenger she could bully. Little did she know, Jacob was just one phone call away from turning her world completely upside down. Vanessa Morgan's day was off to a hectic start, though it wasn't all that unusual for someone working in her field. She had arrived at Los Angeles International Airport LAX earlier than normal because a large group of first-class travelers needed extra assistance. They were all part of a major financial conference in New York, and many of these travelers had lofty expectations for their flight. As a flight attendant for Delta Airlines, Vanessa prided herself on maintaining impeccable customer service, at least for those she deemed worthy of it. Standing at the door of the Boeing 757, she greeted first-class passengers with a dazzling smile. She made it a point to notice their clothes, jewelry, or any small detail that might hint at the size of their wallets. She poured out her politeness onto the men and women donning designer suits, premium leather shoes, and expensive watches. If there was one thing Vanessa had learned in her tenure, it was that first-class treatment was so often reciprocated with generous tips and connections, and she believed that cultivating that circle of power and wealth would help her climb the ladder in life. Her mood began to sour, however, the moment she spotted Jacob Thompson entering the jet bridge. At a glance, Jacob was tall and confident, wearing a navy blue suit that was neither flashy nor obviously branded. Truthfully, it was a decent suit, but Vanessa took one look at it and decided it must have been off the clearance rack. She noticed that the elbows looked slightly worn, and the stitching near the collar wasn't perfectly aligned. She spotted a scuff on his black lace-up shoes and an older, somewhat scratched watch around his wrist. To her, these small details equated to cheap. She couldn't help but roll her eyes as Jacob approached. He was politely staying behind an older woman who was taking her time placing her bag in the overhead compartment. He patiently waited, offering to help if she needed it, but Vanessa stood there, tapping her foot. She wondered, why would someone like him even buy a first-class ticket? The absurdity rankled her sense of propriety. She felt certain he'd used miles or some promotional deal to pretend he belonged in first class. Jacob didn't notice her immediate disdain. Instead, as he stepped forward, he offered a warm smile, greeted her, and handed her his boarding pass. His manners were impeccable, and his voice was tinged with an East Coast accent that hinted at refined schooling. But Vanessa, set in her prejudiced assumptions, barely glanced at him before glancing at his name, Jacob Thompson. She deduced nothing special from his name and resolved to be as curt as possible. After all, she had more important people to attend to. That was the moment an older gentleman in a tailored Armani suit walked in behind Jacob. Vanessa's entire demeanor shifted. In an instant, she greeted the older man with the warmth of a summer day, ignoring the fact that Jacob was in mid-sentence, thanking her for checking him in. She brushed past Jacob, figuratively and literally, to gush over the older gentleman, addressing him by his last name, Mr. Alcott. "So wonderful to see you again. We hope you enjoy your flight to New York." Jacob blinked, taken aback, but said nothing. He stepped aside and politely let Vanessa cater to Mr. Alcott. Then, quietly, he made his way to his first-class seat, 2A, apparently not letting the slight get to him. Yet it was there, simmering in the back of his mind, just the first sign that perhaps this flight attendant would have some hard lessons to learn. The first-class cabin was more crowded than usual, and that meant Vanessa had more tasks than she typically did. Yet she didn't mind the extra workload. She thrived on the hustle of attending to wealthy clients, passing out premium beverages and the hot towels that signaled the beginning of the pampered experience. She had all but forgotten about Jacob until she caught sight of him trying to place his carry-on in the overhead bin. Jacob's carry-on was a little worse for wear, a durable Samsonite that had seen better days. Vanessa walked over, offering to help, but her tone betrayed her distaste. "Sir, if you're struggling with your bag, I can stow it somewhere else," she said. The words themselves sounded polite, but her inflection dripped with condescension. She was essentially implying he might not handle even that simple task. "I'm all set, thank you," he replied with the same warm courtesy he had shown earlier. He clicked the overhead bin shut with no effort and sat down. Vanessa lingered, eyeing him with a hint of a smirk. She couldn't resist a parting comment. "It's an awfully big bag," she said. "I'm surprised you haven't checked it in, but I guess if you're trying to avoid extra fees." Jacob's brow furrowed. "Actually, they checked my other bag, and this one contains some important items. Either way, I think we're good here." She shrugged and turned away, giving him a dismissive nod. Right behind her was another flight attendant, Carla, who had witnessed the interaction. Carla gave Jacob a sympathetic smile and mouthed, "Sorry." Clearly, she was picking up on the tension that Vanessa was cultivating. Once Vanessa returned to the galley area to prepare pre-flight drinks, Carla pulled her aside and murmured, "What's your problem with that passenger in 2A? He seems nice enough." Vanessa scoffed. "I just can't stand it when people think they can buy a first-class seat and act like they belong to the elite. You can spot them a mile away, the cheap suits, the battered bags. They're just playing at it." Carla frowned. "So what if his suit isn't designer? He's still in first class, and you need to treat all our passengers with the same respect." Vanessa rolled her eyes again. Sure, she said sarcastically. "But you know as well as I do which passengers make our airline money. I'll focus my energy on those who matter." Carla bit her lip, clearly wanting to protest more, but the pre-flight announcements blared over the PAR system. It was time to finalize cabin checks. Vanessa strutted down the aisle in her polished Delta uniform, exuding confidence, perhaps too much confidence. She had no idea that her petty prejudice was leading her straight into a minefield. Once the flight was airborne, the flight attendants began distributing beverages. Vanessa paid special attention to the wealthier clientele, such as Mr. Olcott in 2B, who was apparently a Platinum Medallion member. She made sure to offer him his favorite scotch on the rocks before he even asked for it. When it came to Jacob, however, she practically threw a small plastic cup of water onto his tray, without so much as a polite question about what he'd actually like to drink. Jacob raised an eyebrow. He had noticed her haughty attitude from the start, but had let it go. However, this time it was too blatantly rude to ignore. He summoned the patience to keep his voice even. "Excuse me, miss," he said. "May I have some orange juice instead, if that's not too much trouble?" "Oh, you want orange juice?" Vanessa repeated, as though it were a ridiculous request. Her eyes flicked to the other passengers who were sipping on high-end wines, champagne, and premium liquors. "Yes, fine, I'll bring you one," she said, walking away. Jacob watched her go, a sense of disbelief unfolding in his chest. He leaned toward the window, trying to immerse himself in the partially clouded view of the sky. He tried to focus on the business matters he had to attend to once he landed in New York, reminding himself that not everyone deserved his attention or energy. Vanessa returned moments later with a smaller than usual cup of orange juice, half filled. She plunked it down on his tray without a word. Jacob stared at it, then at her. The tension between them was almost palpable. He had done nothing to earn her ire, but it was clear. She had singled him out for less than stellar treatment. Finally, Jacob decided to address it directly. "Is something bothering you, miss?" he asked politely. "I've noticed you seem displeased with me for some reason. If I've done something to offend you, I'd appreciate knowing what it is." Vanessa's eyes flashed. She threw a patronizing smile his way. "Not at all, sir. I'm just busy," she said, her voice lilting with false sweetness. But as she walked off, she was muttering under her breath, words that Jacob caught in bits and pieces. Cheap suit, miles upgrade, it figures. Jacob took a breath. Something told him it was going to be a long flight. He only hoped that she'd contain her attitude. Little did either of them know that Vanessa's arrogance was about to spiral into something even more toxic. About halfway into the flight, the plane hit a patch of rough turbulence. The pilot's voice came over the intercom, instructing everyone to remain seated with their seatbelts fastened. Vanessa and Carla quickly secured the galley and found their seats in the jump seats at the front of the cabin. It wasn't the worst turbulence by any means, but it lasted for a solid 10 minutes. Drinks jostled on tray tables and overhead bins rattled. Several of the first-class passengers, including Mr. Alcott and a few others, looked visibly uncomfortable. Jacob sat calmly, seemingly unbothered by the rocking plane. When the turbulence finally subsided, the seatbelt sign switched off. Vanessa hurried to check on Mr. Alcott and offered him an apology and a refill of his scotch. He gratefully accepted, and they exchanged some pleasant banter about his trip. Once she had seen to his comfort, Vanessa did a cursory walk-through of the rest of the cabin. She passed by Jacob, who had closed his eyes to rest. She paused, noticing a pen and a notepad on his tray table, filled with neat handwriting. Curiosity, or perhaps contempt, got the better of her. As she walked by, she let out a small, exasperated sigh, loud enough that Jacob heard it. He opened his eyes. "Is there something I can help you with?" he asked gently. Vanessa snorted. "Just making sure everything is in order. Wouldn't want anything spilled." "Do you need any more orange juice?" she asked, the question dripping with sarcasm. Jacob held her gaze. "I'm fine, thank you." Instead of walking away, Vanessa continued, "So, are you traveling for work or leisure?" Her tone made the question sound more like an interrogation than a friendly inquiry. He answered politely, "Work, but I'll have a little leisure as well. I have some business meetings in New York." Vanessa made a show of looking him up and down, her eyes lingering on the visible wear in the fabric of his suit. "What line of work?" she asked with forced politeness. He hesitated, not sure why she was prying. "I'm in consulting," he replied, choosing to keep it vague. She gave him a sardonic smile. "Consulting? Ha! Well, I guess it must be worth the occasional upgrade." With that, she pivoted, leaving him with the distinct impression that she was mocking him. From across the aisle, Carla witnessed the exchange. Once Vanessa returned to the galley area, Carla shot her a disapproving look. "You're crossing a line," Carla murmured under her breath. Vanessa merely shrugged. "He's not complaining," she retorted, though her eyes betrayed her. She clearly enjoyed the small power trip. If he wants to complain, he can. "But do you really think anyone will take his side over mine?" That question hung in the air, heavy with implication. Carla frowned, but couldn't find the right words to counter Vanessa's brazen attitude. She wondered if all this animosity stemmed purely from the perceived cheapness of his suit, or if Vanessa harbored deeper, uglier biases she wasn't openly acknowledging. A few hours into the flight, a flight attendant's usual duties included collecting trash, refreshing drinks, and providing meals. In first class, that meant offering premium meal choices. Vanessa was in charge of the meal service, so she diligently went through the small menu with each passenger, describing the gourmet options: seared salmon with a lemon beurre blanc sauce, or roast chicken with a side of truffle mashed potatoes. She lavished extra warmth on those she deemed worthy, even offering them her personal culinary recommendations. When she reached Jacob's row, she recited the menu so quickly that the words blurred together. "Salmon or chicken, which do you want?" she rattled off, crossing her arms. Before he could fully register, she tapped her foot. "Sir, we don't have all day." Jacob studied her face for a long moment. At last he said politely, "I'll have the salmon, please." "Fine," Vanessa replied tersely. She scribbled on her notepad and moved on. Minutes later, when meals were being handed out, Vanessa delivered the salmon to him with a forced smile. It looked appetizing, a seared piece of salmon, lightly glazed, on a bed of risotto. Jacob placed his napkin on his lap and prepared to enjoy his meal, despite the tension that had marked this journey so far. He had barely gotten 2 bites in when a commotion broke out in the row behind him. Apparently, Mr. Alcott had been served the chicken dish when he had requested salmon. The passenger was complaining loudly, insisting that he'd specifically asked for salmon and that it was unacceptable for a Platinum Medallion member to be denied his first choice. Vanessa's eyes widened in dismay. She hurried to Mr. Alcott's side, apologizing profusely. "I'm terribly sorry, Mr. Alcott. Let me see if we have any extra salmon left." She scurried off to the galley, rummaging through the remaining meals. Meanwhile, Carla was trying to calm Mr. Alcott, offering him a drink while the issue got sorted out. Upon returning, Vanessa's expression was strained. "It seems we're all out of salmon, Mr. Alcott," she said. "But let me see what I can do. Perhaps we can swap meals?" Mr. Alcott bristled. "Swap? That's unprofessional. It's not about the meal, it's about the principle of it." Vanessa swallowed hard. She looked around, scanning the rows until her eyes landed on Jacob, who was quietly eating his salmon. Then a sudden idea, unscrupulous as it was, formed in her mind. After all, Mr. Alcott was an important passenger, someone she'd do anything to keep satisfied. Vanessa marched up to Jacob and put on her best apologetic face. "Sir, I'm afraid there's been a mix-up. We accidentally gave you Mr. Alcott's meal. He specifically requested salmon, and we're completely out of it. Would you mind swapping to the roast chicken? It would mean a lot to us to correct this mistake." Jacob looked at her, taken aback. He glanced down at the partially eaten salmon on his plate, and then up at Mr. Alcott's outraged face. Under normal circumstances, Jacob was a man who believed in being gracious. He might have agreed if the request had been made respectfully. But he had endured hours of condescension and borderline harassment from Vanessa already. The final straw was the contempt he saw in her eyes, as if she fully expected him to comply simply because Mr. Alcott was worth more to her. "Miss," he began politely, "I've already started eating this meal. You gave it to me. I don't believe it's hygienic, or even in line with your airline's standards, to pass a partially consumed meal to another passenger. Moreover, I requested salmon in good faith. I'd like to continue eating it." Vanessa's smile tightened, her eyes narrowing. "I understand, sir, but Mr. Alcott is a Platinum Medallion member, and we pride ourselves on catering to our most loyal customers. I'm sure you can understand the position we're in." Jacob nodded slowly. "I do understand, but with all due respect, I'm also a paying customer. I shouldn't be forced to give up a meal I was served. I'm not comfortable swapping out my plate in the middle of dinner." It was a fair point. No one wanted a half-eaten meal, let alone the potential health violation that might involve. But the logic didn't reach Vanessa's ears. She was focused solely on placating Mr. Alcott. In a fit of desperation or arrogance, likely both Vanessa actually reached for Jacob's tray to take it away. Shocked, Jacob held the tray firmly in place. "I said no," he repeated, his voice calm but stern. That was enough to draw the attention of nearby passengers, who glanced over at the unusual scene. Some were curious, while others seemed embarrassed for the flight attendant who was behaving so unprofessionally. Carla, noticing the commotion, hurried over to intervene. "Vanessa, let's just talk to the lead flight attendant, and see if there's an alternative, she said, placing a hand on Vanessa's arm. Vanessa snatched her arm away, glowering at Jacob for a second more. Then, in a forcedly cheery tone, she said, "Enjoy your meal, sir," before turning on her heel. Her face was red with anger. Her quick steps carried her down the aisle to appease Mr. Alcott with extra courtesy and a promise to refund part of his ticket or offer him a voucher for a future flight. Anything to keep him happy. Jacob let out a silent breath and continued his meal. A part of him wished he had the energy to argue further, but he'd learned long ago to pick his battles carefully. He would address this situation, but he would do it on his own terms, and soon. After the meal fiasco, an awkward tension filled the first-class cabin. Passengers whispered to each other about the flight attendant who had tried to yank a plate away from a seated passenger. Some were appalled, others just bemused. Carla was apologizing left and right, trying to salvage the airline's reputation with smiles and small gestures of kindness. Jacob leaned back in his seat, finishing the last bite of his salmon. He sipped his orange juice, ironically finding it refreshing in light of the drama. He wiped his mouth with a napkin, then resumed taking notes in his notepad, likely preparing for his upcoming meeting. That's when Vanessa approached again, her eyes scanning for an opportunity to undermine him further. She noted that Mr. Alcott was now calmed down, sipping his scotch and nibbling on the chicken dish, which was, ironically, quite high-end as well, but her ego was bruised from the confrontation with Jacob. She wanted to reassert her authority. She sidled up to his seat with a falsely sweet smile. "I apologize for earlier," she said, though her tone suggested anything but sincerity. "I just wanted to let you know we do have a seat available in economy, if you'd prefer a more peaceful flight. I understand you might be more comfortable there. No extra cost, of course." Jacob blinked, incredulous. Was she really suggesting he move to economy halfway through the flight while he was in the middle of enjoying a service he had paid for? He stared at her, at a loss for words. "No, thank you," he managed after a moment. She smirked. "All right then, just letting you know it's an option." She turned away, scanning the cabin in an exaggerated manner, as if everything else bored her. Jacob closed his eyes, exhaling slowly. He reminded himself of the principles he'd been taught by the mentors in his life: always maintain your composure and never let your temper cloud your judgment. But his patience was wearing thin. This was more than just a series of small slights. It was a concerted effort to degrade and humiliate him. When Vanessa retreated to the galley, Carla cornered her, seething with frustration. "You just offered him a seat in economy as if you're doing him a favor. Are you out of your mind? That's downright hostile. I might have to report this to the supervisor on the ground once we land." Vanessa waved her off. "Calm down, Carla," she hissed. "Don't be so dramatic. That passenger is trouble. I'm just keeping my options open for resolving the tension." The irony of her statement was lost on her. Carla shook her head, at a loss for how to break through Vanessa's smug, prejudiced exterior. She considered approaching the lead flight attendant, but she was worried about creating a scene mid-flight. One way or another, Carla knew this wasn't going to end well for Vanessa if she continued on this path. Hours crept by at cruising altitude. The cabin lights were dimmed, allowing passengers to rest or watch in flight entertainment. Jacob decided to read through some documents related to a venture capital deal he was evaluating. Occasionally, he'd shift in his seat, uncomfortable not physically but emotionally, under the watchful, judgmental eyes of Vanessa. He was in the middle of a paragraph when she breezed by again. This time, she paused near his seat and leaned in. Her perfume was overwhelming, and her forced smile glinted in the dim light. "I noticed your watch earlier," she said, her tone dripping with false curiosity. "Is that like some sort of collector's item?" Jacob looked at his watch, a well-worn Seiko that had belonged to his late father. Though it wasn't flashy or expensive in the conventional sense, it held immense sentimental value. "It's a family keepsake," he replied softly. "It means a lot to me." Vanessa snorted lightly as if it were a joke. "Oh, I saw the scratches. I thought maybe you dropped it or something." "Surprised you didn't get a new one before this trip." Jacob's jaw tightened. This was too much. She was openly mocking him yet again. "I don't need a new one. This one does the job just fine," he replied tersely. She opened her mouth to say something more, perhaps another insult, but Carla, who was coming down the aisle from the other direction, intervened. "Vanessa, we need your help in the galley now." Her tone brooked no argument. Vanessa gave Jacob one last look, something between disdain and challenge, before leaving. Jacob set his notepad aside and took a deep breath. Enough was enough. He didn't believe in making a scene, but he also believed in standing up for himself. Besides, the principle of the matter wasn't just for him. There could be other passengers who had suffered under this flight attendant's prejudice and bullying tactics. He pulled out his phone, which was on airplane mode, but he knew that once they landed, he'd be able to access some contacts that might address this situation far more effectively than a simple customer service email. Jacob was no ordinary consultant. He had extensive connections in the corporate world and more than a few friends in high places, including Delta's senior legal counsel in Atlanta. Just then, the aircraft cabin lights flickered. Over the intercom, the captain announced that they were encountering another batch of turbulence. He instructed the flight attendants to secure the cabin and buckle up. With a groan, passengers slid their seatbelts tight. Carla and Vanessa hurried to strap themselves into their jump seats once more. The turbulence this time was rougher, and the plane shuddered alarmingly. The seatbelt sign glowed overhead, accompanied by a soft chime. Drink cups rattled, overhead bins clapped, and a collective hush fell over the passengers, replaced by the drone of the engines and the roar of the unstable air current outside. Memories unspooled in Jacob's mind, a flashback to a time when he was a child, flying with his mother on a similarly turbulent flight. They had been terrified, but a kind flight attendant had eased their worries, reassuring them every step of the way. He wished that kindness had been repeated on this journey. Instead, he had faced scorn and mockery. When the turbulence calmed and the seatbelt sign turned off again, Vanessa resumed her duties. This time, her face was a shade paler. Whether from the turbulence or something else, she seemed rattled. She walked down the aisle to check on passengers, plastering a painted-on smile for those she deemed important. When she came to Jacob, however, she paused, pursed her lips, and moved on without a word. Jacob inhaled. The flight would land in another couple of hours, and he'd be free from this toxic environment. But he also knew that letting this go without recourse wasn't an option. Too many times, people in positions of minor authority used that authority to belittle others. He was determined that Vanessa would learn a lesson, not out of spite, but out of justice. Carla found a moment to chat with Jacob when Vanessa stepped into the restroom. Leaning in, she whispered, "Sir, I'm so sorry about Vanessa's behavior. This is not how we do things at Delta." Jacob nodded politely. "I appreciate your concern. It's not your fault, but I'm surprised she's so comfortable acting this way." Carla sighed. "She usually targets folks she thinks won't complain or won't be taken seriously. Unfortunately, I've seen her do this before, but I've never seen her push quite this far." Jacob frowned. "She's done this to other people?" Carla grimaced. "Not always so blatantly. But yes, her prejudice, or whatever you want to call it, it's part of her pattern. You're not the first passenger she's singled out." She checked over her shoulder nervously. "Just know that I'll support you if you choose to file a complaint. She shouldn't get away with it." Jacob thanked her, appreciating her honesty. A renewed sense of determination took root in his mind. He was done letting people like Vanessa skate by, especially when they wielded prejudice as a weapon. He might not be wearing $1,000 suit, but he had resources, real resources, and if it came down to it, he would make that one phone call that could shift the course of someone's career. The final hours of the flight were uneventful. Vanessa avoided Jacob altogether, focusing her attention on the other passengers. Meanwhile, Carla continued doing her best to be gracious and polite, offering Jacob and everyone else small perks, like an extra dessert or a refill on drinks, to compensate for the early attention. Eventually, the pilot announced their descent into John F. Kennedy International Airport. The plane's nose tilted downward as the city lights of New York came into view. Passengers began stowing their personal items, shutting off laptops and tablets. Flight attendants performed one last sweep, ensuring seatbelts were fastened, tray tables were up, and seats were in their upright positions. Vanessa, forced to walk through the first-class cabin one more time, couldn't resist a final jab at Jacob. She leaned close and whispered, "Just a heads up, sir. I'll be informing security that you were causing a disturbance on board, so don't be surprised if they want a word with you after we land." She ended the sentence with a saccharine smile and moved on. Jacob's eyes widened. He couldn't believe her audacity. He had been nothing but polite, or at least calm, in the face of her insults, and now she was threatening him with a security issue? It was beyond unprofessional, it was malicious, and it was definitely the last straw. He decided then and there that he would make that phone call. Not to the standard customer service line, not to some powerless representative. He had the direct line of an executive at Delta, someone with real power. He also had the phone number of a close friend who was a prominent civil rights attorney in New York. If Vanessa wanted to escalate things, he'd meet her at that level, and then some. The aircraft touched down smoothly on JFK's runway. As the plane taxied, the flight attendants reminded everyone to remain seated with seatbelts fastened. When they finally parked at the gate, the seatbelt sign dinged off, and passengers stood to gather their belongings. Jacob took his time collecting his bag from the overhead bin, trying to quell the anger simmering in his veins. He was perfectly composed on the outside. There would be no outburst, no shouting match, no drama. Just the calm, calculated action of a man who knew how to handle injustice. Carla gave him a small nod of encouragement, as if saying, "Do what you need to do." As Jacob stepped into the aisle, Vanessa appeared at the front, directing passengers off the plane. She flashed a plastic smile at everyone, but her eyes glanced over Jacob's shoulders, perhaps expecting security. No one was there. She frowned slightly, then quickly fixed her expression and said, "Have a nice day," in the most monotonous tone possible when it was. Jacob's turn to disembark. He responded with a polite, "You too," and stepped off, feeling a strange sense of relief just to be out of her presence. But the real showdown was about to begin. Jacob waited until he was inside the terminal, near an empty row of seats against a wide window overlooking the tarmac. He wanted a measure of privacy. He set his carry-on down, pulled out his phone, and switched it from airplane mode to full signal. A flood of notifications appeared, but he ignored them all. There was only one call he intended to make right now. He scrolled through his contacts and found the name Michelle Bradley, Delta Senior Legal Counsel. He tapped the number. The phone rang twice. A sharp, professional voice answered. "Hello?" Jacob's voice was calm, measured, but unmistakably serious. "Michelle, it's Jacob Thompson. I just got off a Delta flight, and we have an issue that needs your immediate attention." There was a slight pause. Then her tone shifted from polite greeting to concerned friend. "Jacob? Of course. What happened?" Jacob scanned the area, noticing a few straggling passengers from his flight. None seemed to pay him any attention. "I've encountered a flight attendant who repeatedly discriminated against me, made personal insults, attempted to force me to change seats, tried to remove my meal after I'd started eating it, and finally threatened to call security on me. I have it all documented, and there are witnesses. I'm sure you know how seriously we both take these issues." Michelle inhaled audibly over the line. "That's unacceptable. Do you have the attendant's name, flight number, and all the details?" He glanced at his boarding pass. "Yes, flight number DL4 113 from LAX to JFK. Flight attendant's name is Vanessa Morgan. I'll send you the details and my statement." Michelle's response was immediate. "Jacob, send me everything. I'll escalate this. Discrimination and harassment are not tolerated at Delta. We'll launch an internal investigation right away." Jacob nodded, satisfied. "Thanks, Michelle. I appreciate your help. In the meantime, I'll be consulting my legal team as well. I do want to give Delta an opportunity to do the right thing." She agreed wholeheartedly. "Absolutely. Keep me posted. We value you as a partner and a friend, Jacob. This will be handled." They ended the call. Jacob closed his eyes, feeling a wave of relief. He was well aware that an internal investigation with Michelle at the helm was no joke. Vanessa would soon find out that belittling a paying customer, especially with an undercurrent of racial prejudice, would lead to consequences far harsher than she ever imagined. Vanessa barely had time to catch her breath after disembarking the plane. She went to the crew lounge to freshen up, confident that if security was going to question anyone, it wouldn't be her. She had half expected them to pull Jacob aside at the gate. That he left so calmly made her wonder if maybe he just wasn't as important as she feared. Her phone buzzed with a message from a friend in the airline. The text read, "Did you have an incident on flight DL4 113? Just got word from corporate asking for immediate statements." Vanessa frowned. Anxiety crept into her chest. "Corporate?" She typed back. "Might have had a disagreement with a passenger. Nothing major. Why?" Her friend's reply was quick. "They're taking it seriously. Something about discrimination, harassment. Your name's in the file. You should talk to your union rep." Swallowing hard, Vanessa sank into a chair in the lounge. Her bravado from earlier dissipated like hot steam against a cold window. She began to realize that her actions had not gone unnoticed. She worried about losing her job or facing disciplinary measures. But even then, part of her still clung to the belief that she was in the right, that Jacob was just a troublemaker who had overreacted. Within minutes, her phone rang with a call from the base supervisor. Vanessa stared at it, heart pounding, then reluctantly answered, stepping into an empty corridor. "Hello, this is Vanessa." A brusque voice greeted her. "Vanessa Morgan, I just received notice that you're required to file a formal statement regarding allegations of misconduct on flight DL4 113. You're on immediate administrative leave pending the investigation. Report to my office first thing tomorrow morning." Vanessa's cheeks grew hot. "Administrative leave? But, no buts," the supervisor interrupted. "This is from corporate. I suggest you gather your records and your union representative. We'll be expecting you." The call ended abruptly, leaving Vanessa in a state of shock. She felt as though the floor had dropped out from under her. Never in her wildest dreams did she expect to face immediate administrative leave. Her mind reeled, searching for a scapegoat or a way to shift blame. But deep down, a cold, creeping dread whispered that she had brought this on herself. Meanwhile, Jacob was already on his way to his hotel in Manhattan. He had a series of meetings lined up over the next few days, but he found himself distracted by the flight attendant's behavior and the phone call with Michelle. At the hotel, he wrote a concise yet detailed email to Michelle, attaching a typed statement of everything that had happened, from her initial snide comments to the final threat at landing. He made sure to emphasize the racial undertones of her mocking references to his appearance and cheap suit. Once that was done, he received a call from his civil rights attorney friend, Marcus Hayes. News traveled fast in their circle, especially with social media and messaging. Marcus sounded outraged. You want to file a public lawsuit, or do you want to handle this discreetly? Jacob paused. I'm giving Delta a chance to address it internally first. If they try to sweep it under the rug or fail to hold her accountable, I'll consider other avenues. Marcus agreed. Smart move. Keep me in the loop. This type of discrimination is exactly what we fight against. People need to know they can't get away with it just because they think someone looks less important. They hung up, and for the first time since the altercation on the plane, Jacob allowed himself to truly relax. He believed in justice, but he also believed in giving people a chance to rectify their mistakes. He only hoped that Delta would do the right thing, and if they didn't, he knew he had the power to push for more. The following day, Vanessa entered the supervisor's office at the Delta crew base in JFK, accompanied by a union representative named Lisa. The supervisor, a stern-faced woman named Marcia, sat behind a desk with a folder open. She gestured for Vanessa to sit. The tension in the room was thick enough to cut with a knife. Marcia wasted no time. Vanessa Morgan, we've received a formal complaint that includes allegations of discrimination, harassment, and unprofessional behavior. This complaint is backed by passenger statements, including one from another flight attendant, Carla Ramirez. It also mentions that the passenger in question, Mr. Jacob Thompson, has connections to our corporate legal counsel. Vanessa's mouth dropped open. Carla? She felt a surge of betrayal. She stammered, Carla must have misunderstood. Marcia held up a hand. Miss Morgan, we also have statements from at least 2 other first-class passengers who witnessed the meal incident. They corroborate Mr. Thompson's version of events. Lisa, the union rep, put a reassuring hand on Vanessa's shoulder, but she looked grim. What exactly is Delta asking of us here? Marcia leaned forward. Delta has zero tolerance for harassment or discrimination, including racism. The complaint specifically references racially charged undertones in Miss Morgan's remarks. As of this moment, Miss Morgan is on administrative leave without pay, pending further investigation. She's to have no contact with the complainants or any staff members who are potential witnesses. Vanessa felt a wave of panic. Without pay. This is insane. I never said anything about his race. Marcia's voice hardened. We have multiple witnesses who say otherwise, or at least that your remarks carried an implied bias. We also have notes of you ridiculing Mr. Thompson's attire, threatening to downgrade him to economy, and telling him you'd report him to security without just cause. Vanessa's mind swirled. She wanted to deny everything, but there was too much evidence. Her union rep simply asked, "What are Miss Morgan's options at this point?" Marcia pursed her lips. She can either resign or await the outcome of the investigation. If found guilty of misconduct, she may face termination. Depending on Mr. Thompson's actions and whether or not he pursues legal avenues, this could escalate further. The word termination rang in Vanessa's ears. She had never imagined that a single flight could cost her career. She clenched her fists, wishing she had never crossed paths with that cheap suit nobody. But deep down, a nagging voice told her that she had orchestrated her own downfall by letting her prejudices and arrogance dictate her actions. Vanessa left the meeting in a daze. Lisa, the union rep, tried to console her. "We'll do what we can, Vanessa, but if the evidence is stacked against you, it's going to be an uphill battle. You should prepare for the worst." Walking through the airport in civilian clothes, Vanessa felt invisible. She no longer wore her crisp Delta uniform or the authority that came with it. She recalled the way she had strutted down the aisles, so confident that her position gave her the right to belittle others. Now, she was just another troubled face in the crowd. She remembered the final glare Jacob had given her before exiting the plane, the calm in his eyes as he said nothing, yet promised retribution. She had assumed he was powerless, but he had turned out to be connected in ways she never imagined. The bitterness that flooded her was partly directed at him, but also at herself. Without her job, she realized she had little else. She had thought that by catering to wealthy passengers and dismissing those she deemed unimportant, she was somehow moving closer to a life of prestige. Instead, she had lost sight of the very basics of human decency, like kindness and respect. Back in the corporate offices in Atlanta, Michelle Bradley reviewed all the evidence. She spoke to Carla Ramirez by phone, who recounted every detail of Vanessa's actions, the sarcasm, the attempts to remove Jacob's meal, the menacing offer to move him to economy, and the final threat to call security. Carla also mentioned that she had seen this pattern of behavior from Vanessa before. Though less extreme, Michelle was appalled. "Thank you, Carla," she said. "Your honesty is appreciated. Delta will handle this matter swiftly." In that same hour, Michelle spoke to her internal team, legal colleagues, and HR representatives. They convened an emergency meeting. The consensus was clear. Vanessa Morgan had violated multiple company policies, potentially opening Delta to a lawsuit. The nature of her statements and the credible witnesses left little doubt about her guilt. Within a day, they concluded the investigation with a recommendation for immediate termination. A message was sent to Delta's upper management and the union. Michelle also left a voicemail for Jacob Thompson, informing him of the internal resolution and offering a formal apology from Delta, along with a compensation package for the distress he suffered. Vanessa was summoned back to the supervisor's office on the third day after the flight. She arrived with Lisa, her face pale and drawn. Marcia greeted them with little fanfare, handing Vanessa a letter. "Miss Morgan," Marcia began, "Delta has concluded the investigation and found your conduct in clear violation of our standards. Effective immediately, your employment is terminated." Vanessa's hand trembled as she took the letter. She scanned the words, each sentence a nail in the coffin of her professional life. "Terminated," she whispered, tears burning her eyes. "Isn't there a chance for an appeal or probation?" Marcia shook her head. "Not in this case. The evidence is overwhelming. We can't afford to keep someone on staff who treats passengers with such blatant disrespect." Lisa placed a comforting hand on Vanessa's shoulder, but she knew there was little to be done. This was the final verdict. Vanessa stood up on unsteady legs, tears now spilling freely. Her arrogance had melted away, replaced by the cold reality of unemployment. Without that job, she had no steady income, no health benefits. She had moved to an expensive neighborhood, anticipating promotions that never came. Now her dreams had collapsed, all because she had made it her mission to humiliate a man in a cheap suit, a man who turned out to have the power to topple her carefully curated facade. A week later, Jacob was finishing up his business in New York. He had just wrapped up a successful meeting with a group of investors. Sipping a latte at a cafe near Columbus Circle, he checked his phone messages. One voicemail stood out. "Michelle Bradley, Delta Airlines." He listened to the voicemail, hearing Michelle's formal apology on behalf of Delta and her confirmation that the flight attendant in question was no longer employed with the company. They offered him a generous compensation package, a combination of travel vouchers, upgraded status, and a monetary sum. "We value your comfort and trust in our airline," the message concluded. Jacob exhaled softly, relief mingling with the satisfaction that justice had been served. He had no intention of publicly dragging the airline through the mud as long as they had taken appropriate disciplinary action and seemed sincere in their apology. True to his word, he'd let Delta handle it from within. He dialed Michelle back. She answered on the second ring, sounding both formal and warm. He thanked her for Delta's prompt action, accepted the apology, and said he would forward the details to his attorney as a formality. He didn't necessarily want to profit from the ordeal, but it was good to know the airline recognized the gravity of the situation. "That's wonderful to hear," Michelle said. "If you need anything else, please don't hesitate to reach out. This situation should never have happened, and we're committed to ensuring it never happens again." Jacob ended the call, feeling a sense of closure. He hoped Vanessa Morgan would learn a lesson from this, a harsh lesson, no doubt, but one that might set her on a better path. For Vanessa Morgan, life took a steep downward turn. She tried to find work with other airlines, but the black mark on her employment record haunted her. Word travels fast in the aviation industry, and no hiring manager was willing to overlook a formal termination for harassment and discrimination. Desperate, she found a temporary job as a server at an upscale restaurant near Times Square, but it didn't last. She found herself treating certain customers rudely again, and her manager fired her within a month. Financial pressures mounted, rent was overdue, credit card bills stacked up. Her once glamorous life footing the bill for designer shoes, hoping to mingle with first-class passengers, was replaced by the bleak reality of ramen noodles and second-hand clothing. Each day she remembered Jacob Thompson, the cheap suit passenger, with an odd mixture of resentment and regret. It was impossible to deny that her own behavior had lit the fuse on her downfall. Eventually, she realized she needed true change. She joined a local community center program that focused on counseling and personal development. Through group sessions, she confronted her biases and the root causes of her need to belittle others in order to feel powerful. It was a painful process, but it was her last hope to reinvent herself and potentially seek out a career that wouldn't require her to put on a customer service mask she so often misused. As the months rolled by, Vanessa gradually learned the value of humility. She took a part-time position as a receptionist at a non-profit organization focused on community outreach, ironically working with people who came from all walks of life, wearing everything from high-end suits to threadbare attire. It was there, in seeing their humanity up close, that she finally began to grasp the deeper lesson that had once eluded her. Respect shouldn't be reserved only for those who appear wealthy or influential. Kindness was meant for everyone. Jacob Thompson, meanwhile, continued to thrive in his consultancy. The fiasco with Vanessa Morgan became a footnote in his life, a reminder that you never truly know a person's power or standing just by looking at them. But more importantly, it reaffirmed his belief that big or small acts of discrimination need to be addressed. The world changes one action at a time, and even a single flight can serve as the turning point in someone's life. He found himself traveling again a few months later, this time on a different route. As he boarded, the flight attendants greeted him warmly, scanning his boarding pass. He wore the same navy blue suit. It still had the faint signs of wear, the edges a bit frayed, but he wore it proudly, in memory of the humble beginnings he'd come from and the values that shaped him. Settling into his seat, Jacob looked around at the diverse array of passengers. Some wore fancy clothes, some wore casual outfits, no one outwardly distinguished. He smiled to himself, thinking how each person had a story, a background, a hidden reservoir of strength. It was easy to judge, but far more rewarding to connect. And so, life went on. In one corner, Vanessa Morgan was learning to rebuild a life from the ashes of her arrogance. In another, Jacob Thompson was continuing forward with unwavering grace. The balance had been restored, proof that sometimes all it takes is one phone call to reveal who people really are, and to remind the world that justice, though slow at times, will find its way to those who deserve it. Thank you for joining us on this roller coaster of a story, where one flight attendant's arrogance collided with the quiet strength of a man who refused to be disrespected. Flight attendant laughs at black man's cheap suit. She regrets it. When he makes one call, reminds us that prejudice often thrives under the surface of seemingly polite society, waiting for a moment to manifest. But it also proves that accountability is just a phone call away, and that status or attire doesn't define a person's worth. If you enjoyed this story, please make sure to like the video and share it with your friends. Don't forget to subscribe to the channel for more inspirational, dramatic, and thought-provoking tales. Your support helps us continue to bring stories that entertain, educate, and challenge our perspectives on life and human decency. Together, we can amplify empathy and understanding.